Good afternoon. Welcome to our Arizona State Office of Rural Health webinar. It is a little afternoon and we are still having people join the session. So as people are joining the session, I'd like to welcome you to our monthly series. My name is Jennifer Peters. I'm with the Arizona Center for Rural Health. And the purpose of our State Office of Rural Health webinar series is to provide technical assistance to rural stakeholders to disseminate research findings, policy updates, best practices, and other rural health topics to statewide rural partners and stakeholders. So we welcome you to our session today on this very important and current topic of preventing evictions in rural Arizona. Few webinar tips and notes before we begin. The audience is muted during the presentation, but we highly encourage you to enter any and all questions into the chat box. We will have time at the end of the presentation to open up for questions, and the presenters and myself will read your questions and answer them and provide additional resources. The webinar is being recorded. We know it's a busy time for everyone, so if there are people in your network who would like to have this information, or if you would like to access it after the fact, it will be posted on our Arizona Center for Rural Health website and the website of the Southwest Telehealth Resource Center. So today we're joined by a dynamic panel, some might say a dream team, and so I'd like to introduce them briefly. We'll be joined by Joanna Carr, who is the Research and Policy Director at the Arizona Housing Coalition, Hillary Evans, who is the Resource Strategy and Community Engagement Supervisor for the Crisis Response Network, which oversees the community engagement team for Arizona 211 system, and Charlie Dowdy, who is the managing attorney at the Flagstaff area DNA or People's Legal Services Office. So with that, I'd like to turn over the controls to Hillary, and we will listen to the presentation, and please do use the chat box for any of your questions.
Thank you, Jen. My screen. Welcome, everyone. We're glad to be here today. We are a few of the folks that are working statewide to try and address the onslaught of evictions that we're facing under COVID-19. Our learning objectives for today are to understand the protections of the CDC moratorium, to understand the rental assistance resources available for COVID-19 related financial hardships, and to understand how to connect tenants to free and low cost legal services. As Jennifer already showed, this is the folks that are joining us, Joanna and Charles and myself. And I'm going to turn it over to Charlie now to go over the CDC moratorium.
And at this time, I'm not seeing the presentation.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's working.
Oh, let's try that again.
There we go. Looks great.
Okay, wonderful. Let me.
We're looking at the websites right now, not the PowerPoint. There you go.
There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Now I'll turn it over to Charlie.
Great, thanks, Hillary. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for attending. As I understand, and trying to tailor the presentation to the attendees who are maybe not necessarily themselves facing evictions, maybe they are, but in a position to provide information and provide resources to low-income folks that might be in this situation. A little bit of background: the Centers for Disease Control issued this moratorium back in September of last year. It's been extended a number of times. The initial expiration was in December of 2020. It was extended a couple times, and it's currently good through June 30th of this year. I'll talk a little bit more about how that deadline, in a good way for tenants and in a potentially bad way for tenants, is not necessarily set in stone, but that's what we have right now. It's still temporary at this point, and most evictions for the non-payment, and we'll talk more about which ones would likely apply, are placed on hold to help prevent the spread of the virus. Standard rental housing, mobile homes, land and mobile home park. We're not looking at the coverage on motels, hotels, other guest homes. I would expand that to likely include student housing as well, and then social services provided housing in addition to those exceptions. Who qualifies? It needs to be either a tenant or lessee, so some kind of legal relationship of the person that lives there, or a resident. What I think that the difference is among those three is that there's a legal landlord-tenant relationship or lessor-lessee relationship, typically in writing. It does not necessarily have to be in writing. Or a resident, somebody who might not be a named person on a written lease, but does reside at the property, lives there, maybe somebody, a child or adult child of somebody, or a friend who's known to be residing at that property. You may qualify, or a person may qualify for the moratorium if they can provide a signed declaration that has 5 affirmative things that they would agree to or say that apply to them, and a couple that of acknowledgments that they would make as well. First requires, this is a quotation from the order, somebody that has used their best efforts to obtain all available government assistance for rent or housing. What I would say as a tip is that best efforts does not mean that you have exhausted every single effort. I think that in most cases, applying to the programs that Joanna's going to mention later, filling out those applications, contacting those resources will be sufficient. There are a number of organizations that have access to government provided money. Typically, you're not going to need to go to the county and Salvation Army and St. Vincent de Paul and Catholic Charities. Usually, I would expect a court to consider the effort to contact the main government resource for assistance to be sufficient for that. There is the financial requirement, generally in addition to the requirements here, if they have received the stimulus payment either in 2020 or in 2021, that would apply. If the person was not required to report income in 2020 as well. And I would also say that if you're in the situation, if the tenant is in the situation where they expect to earn, or did not actually earn more than $99,000 in 2020, or do not expect to earn more than that amount in 2021, that they would qualify as well. Unable to pay rent in full or make full housing payments due to lost job, lost income, loss of hours, diminished wages, layoff, or significant out-of-pocket medical expenses. I've had some clients that weren't sure if this applied to them, the medical costs in particular, because their medical cost was not related to COVID. There is no requirement that medical cost be coronavirus related. That can be any other out-of-pocket expense that meets the financial requirements there. The next part on this slide, making their best efforts to make timely partial payments. The landlord does not have to accept the partial payments. What we encourage folks to do is make sure that they have documented why they believe that the partial payment that they're offering is as close to the full amount as possible, to list out for their own personal reasons, have the list of disposable income, include that in their consideration and their calculation, and then document how and when they made the offer of the partial payments. Again, the landlord does not have to accept that, and I've seen very few instances in my experience where landlords are accepting the partial payments. The last kind of affirmative provision that the tenant would need to agree to is that they would have to declare that they would likely become homeless, live in some kind of shelter or congregate living, move in somewhere else with friends or family because they have no other options, that would be the same or lower cost than their current options as well. One thing that's very important for all tenants to understand, and something that they need to affirmatively acknowledge, is that they still will be obligated to pay rent for the entire term of the lease at the end of the moratorium. One thing that our offices are expecting, we're expecting a very large flood of civil judgment cases being filed, essentially trying to collect that back owed rent. The last one is a perjury acknowledgement, just acknowledging that if they make any false or misleading statements, it could result in perjury charges and potentially criminal or civil actions against them. I think the most important thing, and one thing that will make, in my experience, a very big difference, the sooner that a tenant who is facing this situation can contact a lawyer or legal aid, the better it turns out for them. I'll speak to our office's experience in particular. If we have a client who's coming in before they get an eviction notice, expecting that they're likely going to have an eviction notice, what we can do is work with them to try to obtain, give them referrals to the assistants to try to avoid that eviction complaint in the first place. We can sometimes offer to negotiate directly with the landlord. There are just more opportunities for them if the sooner that they come. I will compare that to situations that we've had where somebody did not come in until after their eviction judgment was actually issued. In between the 5 days that the court had to issue the eviction action and then issue the writ of restitution, which allows the constable or sheriff to forcibly remove or change the locks on a tenant. Knock on wood, we've had a couple of really good opportunities and really good situations where we were still able to help that person. A couple people in that situation provide the CDC declaration. We made sure that it applied to them. We got copies to the plaintiff, the landlord that was kicking them out, copies to the justice court, copies to the constable and the sheriff. We just made sure that everyone knew that the declaration applied to this particular tenant. Other tips that I would encourage folks to do, I'd strongly encourage tenants to be advised to keep documentation, to keep a journal about all of their efforts. This is not something that they need to provide necessarily. The background information for the declaration does not need to be provided to the landlord. Many landlords will ask for it. There is no obligation for the tenants to show directly to the landlord what efforts they made, so long as they say that they made best efforts to obtain the government assistance. You do not have to show the application to your landlord unless the landlord gives the court a reason to order that you disclose that. So I encourage people that if they haven't applied for the CDC declaration or haven't gone through those steps, make sure that you keep track of when you do everything, what documents are generated, keep your copies as well. Free low-cost legal services provider, azlawhelp.org is the online portal for figuring out what legal aid organization would potentially be able to help the tenant. That will walk them through a process and have contact information for individual offices if a person would prefer to go to a physical office or use a telephone. I will say that for our organization, we have an emergency policy that if somebody's receiving notice that they're going to be evicted or lose their source of shelter within 5 days, we will prioritize that. And that's something that will go through our system much more quickly than a typical intake. If somebody does not apply for services, and sometimes it's because of financial reasons, sometimes it's because of potential conflicts, I would encourage folks to reach out to the State Bar website, State Bar of Arizona, azbar.org, and click on Find a Lawyer to try to seek out pro bono or low bono assistance from private attorneys. There will be some attorneys that might be willing to consult on a free or reduced rate basis and provide information. I would also say that there are a lot of online resources available for tenants if they don't qualify, if they're unable to research or unable to qualify through legal aid or contact a private attorney. In particular, the Arizona Courts has an eviction website. I know in Coconino County, the Law Library website has a COVID section. AZ Law Help has a COVID section that will discuss a lot of this information and a lot of these resources. And of course, 211, which Hillary will talk about more. A couple other things to add on tips. As far as the declaration goes, make sure that you provide that to the landlord, provide that to the justice court. If an eviction is pending, keep copies for yourself as well, and just make sure that, that the tenant has that. I would also add that this moratorium applies specifically to situations where somebody is not paying or cannot pay or unable to pay. There are also situations where a landlord might decide to terminate a lease or not renew a lease related to the non-payment. In those situations, it's very important, I think, to reach out to an attorney, to talk to an attorney more about that. If somebody's being non-renewed and is also not paying rent, that's a really important distinction there that the court is going to want to know more information about. If somebody is being evicted for a non-renewal and is behind on payments, the court will presume that the moratorium does apply. The landlord can provide evidence to the court that they are not being evicted, or they're not renewing the lease for some other reason. Maybe they're selling the home, maybe there's some repairs that need to happen, but that's something that will be something that the court can consider. Another important thing is that tenants need to realize that the landlord can still file an eviction complaint. A judgment can be obtained, but the writ of restitution, the order that allows the constable or sheriff to actually remove or change the locks on a tenant, that cannot be executed. That's something that is stayed or paused until the end of June right now. Last thing that I would add, I'm going to make sure that I post a link to the CDC declaration form in the chat box. But I mentioned on that June 30th date, there is some caution there. The CDC declaration has been challenged in a few different jurisdictions. So far, it still applies in Arizona, but it's something that's being challenged successfully in Texas and the Sixth Circuit, which is Tennessee, Kentucky, Michigan, and Ohio. As I understand right now, those states are no longer enjoying the protection of the CDC moratorium on the ground. I'm not sure if that is still happening or if local courts are still agreeing to abide by the order. It's my understanding that they shouldn't be or wouldn't be. And of course, the concern is that the CDC declaration could be challenged on a national basis and overturned potentially sooner than that June 30th date. Potential good news is that the current challenge is based on some technical legal things that probably could be fixed if Congress enacts legislation extending that deadline. So that's a good possibility or a hopeful possibility, I would say, of that happening. Service areas, our office will accept cases, DNA People's Legal Services. There is our office will apply for Coconino County. Community Legal Services covers Maricopa, Mojave, Yavapai, Yuma, and La Paz. And Southern Arizona Legal Aid would cover the remaining counties. A couple of questions in the chat. I'm not familiar with hellolandlord.org. I think just kind of in my experience, the CDC declaration that I will post the link to is typically sufficient. It's going to be something that will be familiar to the justice courts if a case goes that far, and will be familiar to a lot of landlords as well. Of course, there will be some ma and pa landlords that maybe are not going to be familiar with that. That's where we got a lot of our cases at the beginning of the moratorium. So I can't say yes or no to hellolandlord.org, but the link that I'll post for the actual form, I'll send a couple because the CDC just issued a new one that I think is pretty user-friendly and very helpful. And I'll also send one from the Arizona Supreme Court website as well.
Thanks, Charlie. I actually wanted to get your input on this. We've been hearing at 211 a lot of tenants don't go to their court appointment, they skip it, or they're too afraid to go, or they don't think they need to go. And then that will immediately result in a judgment. I wonder if you could speak to that and advice about that.
Yes. That's very, very important. Probably the second most important thing after contacting an attorney as soon as possible would be making sure that you attend the court dates. The landlord is required to tell the court whether or not they've received a CDC declaration. That's something that they're affirmatively supposed to answer, whether or not they've received it in any case. Not all landlords will do that. Not all landlords will be aware of that. And I would say in some counties, probably in some jurisdictions, not all judges will follow up on that. The judge will go forward with the eviction order. The judge will go forward with a writ of restitution. And the judges and landlords love these default hearings where a tenant doesn't show up, because it is a literally 3-minute hearing if a tenant does not show up. And in those 3 minutes, the court has already reviewed the paperwork. It would be done and over. There's no opportunity for the court to even know what the tenant's financial situation is. One good thing too, Hillary, if a tenant shows up at that first hearing and says to the court, "Judge, I think that I qualify for the CDC declaration," the court will usually or is supposed to inquire about that. And then the court is obligated to continue the matter to allow that to happen. They will move it out a matter of days or weeks to allow the tenant time to obtain that declaration too. Very, very important that tenants attend any hearings. In our county, the judges are being very accommodating for telephonic appearances. The recent Arizona Supreme Court administrative order mandates that as well. There's currently legislation to make that permanent, to allow tenants the opportunity to appear by telephone as well.
That's great. Thank you so much for that information. We're going to have time for questions at the end, which I'm sure will come up. I'm going to now turn it over to Joanna, who is going to talk to us about rental assistance programs and resources for landlords.
Yep. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today to join this very important discussion. Evictions has been such a huge conversation point through the pandemic, and the need to keep people housed is more critical than ever as we move to keep people safe through the pandemic and beyond. So I'm happy to be here to give this information. So that being said, I'm going to provide an overview of available rental assistance funds and resources and support documents that are available to landlords. First of all, I just want to sort of set the stage that we really are making a push right now for tenants and landlords to be using the resources that are available in the state. And I think that this has been kind of an issue as programs have rolled out, is a lack of understanding of what resources are available, and perhaps, a lack of marketing from fund administrators, etc. So we're really working hard to try to get a list of resources available and get these resources pushed out. Without this emergency rental assistance that we have, we were really truly at risk of the eviction tsunami that people have spoken about, as so many evictions were getting backed up in the courts around the state. And with the CDC moratorium the moratorium extension through June, that provides a really good opportunity to use these next couple of months to make sure that any renters that are at risk of eviction are connected with available resources to clear the rental debt and ultimately remain in their homes. So please share the information among your network, and specifically you're working with any tenants who are at risk of eviction. This is all really important information. So in January of this year, the US Department of Treasury allocated just over $500 million total to Arizona for emergency rental assistance payments to local governments and tribal entities. DES received $303.2 million in emergency rental assistance for all counties aside from Maricopa County, Pima County, and Yuma County. This is huge because prior to the pandemic and these funds coming in, we really had a very limited and fragmented system for rental assistance. So having these dollars specifically allocated for emergency rental assistance provides this great opportunity to help renters that are in these situations where they can't make the rent payment. With the DES program, this opened in February of this year and applications are now being received. We did hear, especially in that first week, that it was slow rolling. Only, I believe, 400 applications were received in the first week, which was surprising when we know the extent of the problem that we face with renters not being able to make their rent payments. And also that was in quite stark contrast to Maricopa County jurisdictions, who can receive thousands within the first few days. So that's where we're a little concerned that perhaps the word isn't getting out to the balance of state communities. I'm just going to drop a link in the chat box here to the DES website, which is the specific page for rental assistance. So this is where renters can make the application and see all of the, oh, it's already in there, thanks Jennifer, see all of the information pertaining to the rental assistance rules, and they can also view details of other rental assistance programs if individuals live outside of those jurisdictions. Additionally, Yuma County are administering their own funds through WACOG, and the web link is available on the slide here. And let me just drop that in the chat box too. This is specifically, as I mentioned, for Yuma County, and they received $6.5 million. Oh, thanks, Jennifer. So any Yuma residents must go through WACOG directly and not through DES. And also, I just wanted to share a resource that we have been developing and continuing to update with Hillary's team at the 211 Crisis Response Network. We've been tracking all rental assistance funds through the pandemic and trying to make sure that this is a list of rental assistance funds that is kept up to date. So all of the new emergency rental assistance fund information has been added to existing funds in that list that we're continuing to update. So that can be used for anybody who is seeking rental assistance. And then just a quick brief overview of the funds and eligibility criteria. The Department of Treasury released an FAQ and guidance that all administering jurisdictions should follow in writing their guidelines. So what this means is that essentially all jurisdictions should really be following the same script when administering the funds, but we are finding that there might be a little variance in some of the provisions that are adopted. But the basic rules are that both landlords and tenants might initiate an application. And this is quite a difference from existing funds where we find that in the past only tenants can make the application. So it just adds, I guess, that extra layer of protection that, if a landlord is, requiring the rent and the tenant hasn't initiated the application, the landlord can do so. There are income limits. There's a maximum income of 80% of the area median income for qualifying households, and households must have qualified for unemployment benefit or must have a COVID-19 related income loss. And there has to be a risk of homelessness, such as an eviction notice, late payment notice, utility shutoff, etc. The funds can also be used for renters that live in mobile homes, manufactured housing, and rent-to-own properties. And another important point is that individuals that live in subsidized housing like Section 8 or Hood VASH can also apply for assistance, but the rental assistance would only apply to that portion of the rent. And the amount of assistance that can be paid is quite significant. 15 months of rent can be covered and can be backdated back to March of last year when the pandemic began. Also, and this is really important, court costs and legal fees can be covered. So I know DES has adopted that and is allowing up to $500 per household for legal fees. So where landlords have already received judgment and have gone through that process, but the moratorium is stopping the eviction, there's going to be legal fees that are owed to the landlord. And so those fees, as I mentioned, up to $500 can be included in the emergency rental assistance application. And then another important point is that eligible utilities can be covered, such as electricity, gas, water, all the main utilities, plus telephone, cable, and telephone, cable, and internet service are not eligible for assistance. But the other point that I want to raise is that the U.S. Department of Treasury released an additional FAQ that stated that administrative agencies can allow for hotel costs to be covered and also for deposits to be covered. And that's for individuals that have been displaced due to COVID-19. So this provides an additional opportunity to really provide some services and assistance to those that may not be housed, but are in a position where they can either find housing and just need that security deposit, or are in a hotel and are struggling to maintain that rental payment. I'm trying to find out if the jurisdictions within Arizona have adopted this, and I'm struggling, so I don't have a specific update, and I'm trying to find that information. So perhaps I can provide, an update by email if needed once we have that information. But that is something that the federal government are allowing to be covered. And then before I move on to the landlord programs, I just wanted to provide some information for households that live on tribal land, because funds were provided specifically to tribal governments for emergency rental assistance using the same guidance, and it was 104 million total for Arizona's tribe. So any household that's living on tribal land would have to reach out to their local tribe to access the funds, rather than going through DES or WCAG. So it's just an important point to make. Those funds are available. So just moving on then to the information on resources for landlords. First of all, I just want to take a moment to explain why resources for landlords are important. Landlords are critical to ensuring that communities have rental units and places to house those experiencing or risk of experiencing housing instability. If our landlords are not provided with the rent, there is a risk of housing loss within our communities due to foreclosure. And there's also, a growing reluctance of landlords to rent to low-income households through the pandemic, unfortunately, and where we have a really hot rental market and a lot of competition for housing, sort of supporting and preserving the landlords that we do have, especially landlords that will rent to low-income families and voucher holders, is really critical. And the pandemic really has highlighted the imbalance that we have in power between landlords and tenants within the Arizona Landlord and Tenant Act, and how that plays out in the court. Many communities within the state and nationally have adopted the discourse that landlords and tenants really need each other more than ever through the pandemic. We need landlords to keep our renters housed. And this was quite hard to adopt that language without rental assistance, as landlords, especially the smaller mom and pop landlords, needed the income. However, now that we have this source of emergency rental assistance, it brings this great opportunity for landlords and tenants to work together to apply for rental assistance and keep the lease going. And that's really important for landlords who have been able to continue to apply for eviction and get those judgments, since the moratorium only stops that enforcement stage. So healthy and productive communication is critical in this effort. And to that end, we've created a couple of resources in partnership with the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania and again, the 211 Crisis Response Network team. The first is a toolkit that provides tips and talking points for landlords to engage in healthy and productive communication with their renters. And what we hope from that is more effort to negotiate and mediate and come to arrangements, not to move forward with eviction. And then the second is a support packet that just provides some additional resources to support landlords with the goal of keeping people housed. So again, I'll drop those links in the chat box, but that concludes my part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. There was a question in the chat. Do tenants need to repay the rental assistance amounts that they receive, or that the landlords receive on their behalf?
No, it's not like a loan. It's a grant essentially, so it doesn't need to be repaid.
I appreciate you. You highlighted a couple of really important things to remember, and that it can go back 15 months, which is really amazing. And then also, oh, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was just agreeing.
And then also the need to protect affordable housing and low-income housing in Arizona, since we're seeing such a huge migration of folks into the state. If we lose affordable housing options for folks, we're going to see a very large increase to our homeless population, and we don't want to see that happen. We want to see people stay stably housed. So thank you.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we're starting to see that already. You know, our service providers are struggling more than ever to find landlords willing to rent to those within programs, and so it's really important to make sure landlords have those resources.
Yeah, when Charlie, I was going to ask you this, if you could talk about this. Can you just highlight the barriers that come for people that do end up having an eviction on their record?
Well, one thing is that it's a publicly accessible record. It's something that will show up on public access in Arizona. It's something that can have negative impacts on somebody's credit report, credit scores, and will be searchable for future or by future landlords. A lot of landlords, especially more of the professional landlords, will be very particular about their tenants, because yes, it is a pretty hot market, and they can be picky about to whom they rent. And if they see an eviction on somebody's record, it makes it less likely that they might be willing to enter into a housing agreement with that person. Not only the eviction itself, but of course also the judgment is something that can show up, go through collections, and affect somebody's credit worthiness as well.
Yeah, very lasting impacts. Joanna, there's a policy question that you might want to respond to. Is there any policy solution to prevent or mitigate the buying up of previously affordable homes by investment firms or flippers?
Yeah, there are policy solutions, but unfortunately, those policy solutions are not available in Arizona at this time. And the two that I have in mind is rent control and source of income discrimination, both of which are legislative issues and would need to be enacted by the state legislature. But rent control, would limit the amount of rent that an owner can charge. And the issue that we have here in Arizona is that there isn't any limit. And as people keep moving into the state, as the demand for housing is high, the rent just continues to push up. And it's such a great opportunity for investors. Unfortunately, I heard this horrifying story that investors are literally rubbing their hands together right now at the pandemic for Arizona, because they're just waiting for landlords to be foreclosed and to come in and swoop up the properties and flip them and displace renters. It's a huge problem, and it's quite scary. So rent control could help with that. And then the other is source of income discrimination, which is kind of not directly going to prevent the buying up of homes, but would prevent landlords and property owners from refusing to rent to individuals with low income or vouchers, because that's what we're seeing happening right now is, where a landlord has the choice to either rent to a voucher holder or low income household or a market rent household, then they're choosing that market rent option, unfortunately. So source of income discrimination would prevent that, but again, that would need to be enacted by the state, and we're really not there at the moment.
And I know we're also seeing a lot of turnover, units turning over to be made into vacation units, with so many people traveling to Arizona, and we don't have protections from that as a state either. Do you think that's something that we might be able to address in the future, or is it pretty set in stone?
I hope so. That's such a huge issue. So yeah, it was 2016 that the governor signed an order that prevented municipalities from controlling short-term rental. And again, that comes down to, what is more lucrative for a homeowner, especially in the tourism areas like Sedona, Flagstaff, Scottsdale. You know, we're finding that there's a move to rent out properties on Airbnb, and so that we've lost a lot of housing that way within the state. There has been talk of, you know, pushing to change that legislation and reverse it, but I know that a lot of the conversation was more targeted around the issue of party homes and the neighborhood disturbance. And so I think there was some action there last year to add some protections, but not to reverse that legislation. But it's something that we talk about a lot when we discuss solutions to increase the supply of affordable housing, because anything we do, for example, tiny homes or ADUs, you know, to increase units, there's no protection from a property owner from just using the short-term rental model. So it really does impact our housing stock, unfortunately.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to share just a few resources that you might already be aware of, but during this time, during COVID-19, our 211 calls have predominantly been about rental assistance, low-income housing, and also or low-cost housing, and then also a need for support around utility payments. We've received thousands and thousands of calls each month with folks that are facing eviction and unsure what to do. And in response to that, we created an app that asks a series of questions, and I will go ahead and show that to you. You can see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So the app can be found on our website right here, but there also is a link that you can access directly. And we worked with a number of legal service agencies in the state to create this. And what we wanted to have available is if someone couldn't get through to one of our program specialists that can assist, that they could also do this on the web. So I will show you just really quickly what this covers. It only asked a few questions. This is the recognition that we are not providing legal advice, but just some information and resources. So the first question is, are you experiencing a COVID-19 related financial hardship? I'm going to say yes. It will then ask if you're currently experiencing homelessness. If you are, if you say yes to this, it will take the person to the resources for where to connect in each of the counties to an access point for homeless services. There they can get evaluated for their housing need and get connected to a housing resource. I'm going to say no in this situation. Do you currently owe rent to your landlord? I'm going to say yes. And lastly, have you received a notice from your landlord for non-payment of rent? I'm going to say yes. You would then enter your zip code and it would take you to this report. There are actually a number of reports based on the inputs that people put. This specific report, and I want to make sure that, are you seeing a report on my screen? Okay. So this one is for folks that owe rent and have immediate legal issues. It will go over exactly what Charlie just went over around the CDC moratorium. It will then give guidance, first being, please contact a lawyer or a legal aid organization, and it will give the information of how to do so. People can always call 211 and say, I need help contacting a lawyer. I don't have any income, or I'm in this county, I'm in this city, what do I do? And the specialist will be able to walk them through that. But they can also click through these links. These are hyperlinks that will take them to different resources. I just learned today that this hotline is no longer going to be available, so we'll be changing that shortly. It will also give them the link to how to sign the CDC moratorium, the paper that the signed declaration that they're supposed to provide to their landlord. And then it will give some of the advice that you heard from Charlie. Do this as soon as possible, keep all records related to rent payment, but also records related to conversations with your landlord. It will remind them that they still owe rent. This doesn't absolve them from owing rent to the landlord. It will talk about the eviction or the evictions that it doesn't protect under the CDC order. And then we'll encourage them to not miss their court appointments, and then gives them information about protecting themselves. And then it will go over the rental assistance programs that Joanna talked about. Let's scan through these. We also provided, and we just added this, information about how to get utility assistance, since folks are calling often about that. Mostly about turning their electricity off. That's been the biggest one, and we're going to see more of that into these hot weather months coming up. Also, we'll provide that website that was mentioned, azevictionhelp.org, which will explain the eviction process and what happens step by step and what they can do in each of those stages. We find that some folks are finding that there's some discrimination going on, whether it's around their income or around race and ethnicity. And so we provide information about that. So this again is available through this app that can be accessed on our website. Our website's going through a major overhaul and will be very user-friendly very soon, which we're excited about. And we'll have resources that should be really helpful. But anytime that someone is facing an issue around paying their rent, needing resources for food, for any kind of security issue, they can call 211 anywhere in the state, and someone will be able to help them and walk them through their services. I encourage people, this is my pro tip, is call after hours. Most people think to call between 9 and 5 because that's when things are open, but 211 is a 24-hour service. So if you're in the middle of the night worrying about something, you could talk to someone. So we encourage people to call at those odd times, get up really early and call, and you'll have a better chance of having someone that has time to really go through all of these things with you. So I'm going to turn it over now and see if there's any questions that folks have for our panelists. And thank you so much for being here, and especially Joanna and Charlie, thank you for sharing your expertise.
Thank you to our panelists, and we are close to the end of the hour, but we still do have a few minutes if people have any questions they want to enter. I know that the panelists are all available for questions after this session too, but are there any more questions that people would like to ask at the moment?
I wanted to say, I forgot to say this, our app is available in Spanish as well.
That's really important. And sometimes I'm amazed at the public services that aren't immediately available in Spanish. So thank you for sharing that and the importance. And I'm also, that actually brings another accessibility question as to, are there services for people who may have other difficulties using computer or hearing or vision difficulties to be able to access information?
So that's why we are, I'll say for 211, our phone-based services, we will walk them through that eviction app, those questions. If someone, we know that having internet can be very spotty in different parts of the state. And so we want people to feel confident in calling us, and that we would be able to walk them through those same questions, and then read that to them or provide that to them in the mail or any way that they would want to have that information. We would make sure they got it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's for us. And then Charlie, you want to speak to the courts and accommodations they're making at this time?
Courts will make interpreters available for folks who request it, and that's supposed to be an easy process to be able to contact the court. If you show up in person, court will have, and they're posted, at least in Coconino County, throughout the courthouse, laminated language papers that you'll be able to use to point to the language of your own native or preference language there. Our office in Flagstaff, we typically have a Navajo interpreter and a Spanish interpreter available. If for some reason, if those employees, coworkers are not available, then we reach out to the language line. We've been able to do that with hearing impaired clients as well and use that service. Our intakes are done primarily over the phone, but we will accept clients on a walk-in basis with appropriate social distancing measures put in place. Don't tell too many people, but I've done house calls if I need to. It's been a long time, but you know, we understand that not everyone is going to have the ability to come to our office also. So if that's something that needs to happen in the future, after things calm down, when things calm down, we're going to have kind of a mobile roadshow that DNA Legal Services will take to more remote parts of the state and our service area as well to provide intakes. It doesn't help a lot for these kind of emergency situations, of course, but it's one of the ways that we're trying to expand our services and our reach throughout our service area.
Great. I know our hope in having this conversation with the Center for Rural Health and all the providers that are on the call is that we've found that, you know, as you saw with Joanna's presentation, that there was such a small amount of applications that went to DES in that first week. And it worried us because there's this huge resource with millions of dollars available to all Arizonans that are facing rental challenges. So we want to make sure that we can get that information out far and wide. There's no reason that anyone that is facing a COVID-19 financial hardship should not be able to pay their rent with the amount of money that has been poured into the state. So we hope that you'll get that message out with us and encourage people to contact 211 if they don't know where to start. We'll get them started, or all the other resources that we listed on this webinar.
Super important. Well, thank you, panelists, so much for spending your hour with us. Thank you to everyone on the call. And we will have this information posted on our website in a visible location and continue to push it out as well through our newsletters. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.